When my husband passed, he left behind three things I did not expect. The first was a garden that had grown completely out of control without him to tend it. The second was a debt I knew nothing about. And the third was a key taped to the back of his favorite photograph, with a note in his handwriting that said, "Go to the bank on Mercer Street. Go alone. Do not take our son with you. Good morning." Dear listeners, this is Hannah, and I am so glad you are here with me today. Please stay until the end, and leave me a comment letting me know what city you are listening from. It means more to me than you know to see how far these stories travel. My name is Margaret Louise Calloway, and I am 68 years old. I spent 39 years married to a man named Thomas. Thomas was a high school history teacher for most of his career, and then a school principal for the last 12 years before he retired. He was the kind of man who remembered every student's name, who kept a worn leather journal on his nightstand, who believed that the most important thing a person could do was pay attention. Pay attention to people. Pay attention to details. Pay attention to the small things that everyone else was too busy to notice. We raised our son, Daniel, in a brick colonial on Sycamore Lane in Roanoke, Virginia. Daniel was our only child. We had wanted more, but it did not happen. And we made peace with that, the way you make peace with most things that are out of your hands, slowly, and not entirely. Thomas died on a Thursday morning in October. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition 2 years prior, and the doctors had been clear that he was managing, not curing. He died in his sleep, which I was told was peaceful, and which I chose to believe because there was no benefit in believing otherwise. He was 64 years old. I had thought we had more time. I think we always think that, after the memorial, after Daniel and his wife, Renata, had flown back to Charlotte, after the neighbors stopped dropping off food and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, I began the work of a widow. There is no good word for it. Sorting. Some people call it settling the estate. The lawyers say. What it actually feels like is reading someone's diary after they are gone. Every drawer you open is an act of intimacy. Every old receipt. Every expired coupon. Every birthday card saved in a shoebox is a small conversation with a voice that no longer answers. Thomas had been organized in the way that teachers are organized categorically, with labels and folders, and a system that made sense to him. Once I learned it, made sense to me too. I worked through his study over the course of 2 weeks, one shelf at a time, one drawer at a time. I found 30 years of journals. I found a folder labeled Emma's College Fund for a niece we had helped through school a decade ago. I found, tucked inside a book about the Civil War that had sat on his shelf since before we were married, a folded piece of paper. I almost did not open it. It looked like a bookmark. It was the kind of small, easy to overlook thing that Thomas would have smiled about if he had seen me nearly miss it. I unfolded it at his desk, standing in the afternoon light. It was a note in his handwriting, and taped to the note was a small silver key, Margaret. He had written my full name, which he only ever used when something was serious. Go to First Coastal Bank on Mercer Street. Ask for the safety deposit box under account 7741 B. The key is this one. Go alone. Do not bring Daniel. Do not bring Renata. I am sorry I did not tell you this while I was living. I was afraid of what it would do to you. I should not have been. You are stronger than I ever gave you credit for. Read everything in the box before you talk to anyone. I sat down in his chair and read the note 4 times. Do not bring Daniel. Thomas adored Daniel. He had coached Daniel's Little League team. He had driven 4 hours each way to watch Daniel's college graduation. He had cried at Daniel's wedding, not a quiet, dignified cry, but the real kind, with a handkerchief pressed to his face and no apology for it. Why would a man who loved his son that completely leave a note telling his wife to keep that son away from a safety deposit box? I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Thomas had been a private man in certain ways. He had handled the household finances without complaint for most of our marriage, because I had been content to let him, and because he found a kind of peace in orderliness that I did not share. Perhaps it was simply a financial matter he had wanted to manage quietly. Perhaps there was a debt he had not wanted Daniel to worry about. Perhaps it was nothing alarming at all. I told myself this with reasonable conviction. And then I put the note and the key in the pocket of my cardigan and went to make dinner. And sat alone at the kitchen table. And could not eat a single bite. That night I did not sleep. I lay in the bed that still held the shape of Thomas's side. And I stared at the ceiling. And I turned the note over in my mind, the way you turn a stone over looking for what is underneath. The specific phrasing kept coming back to me. He had not written, "You don't need to bring Daniel." He had written, "Do not bring Daniel." And he had written Renata's name separately, which was its own kind of emphasis. He had been specific. He had been deliberate. Thomas was always deliberate. By morning, I had not decided anything, but I had put the key in my purse. And I suppose that was its own kind of decision. 3 days passed before I drove to Mercer Street. In those 3 days, Daniel called twice. He was attentive in the way he had been since the funeral, checking in, asking if I needed anything, offering to come back to Roanoke to help with the estate paperwork. He was my son, and I loved him. And the calls were genuinely kind. And I answered them the way I always did. And I said I was managing, which was mostly true. It was Renata who called on the 4th day. Renata was an accountant. She was efficient and precise. And she had been part of our family for 11 years, which was long enough that I had grown genuinely fond of her, not close. Exactly. Buffon. She had a way of moving through problems that I had always admired. Practical. Methodical. She did not linger in feelings when there was action to be taken. She called in the morning, which was unusual. She normally called in the evenings. She asked how I was doing, which was kind. And then she asked whether the estate attorney had been in touch, which was practical. And then she asked something that I did not immediately register as unusual, but which sat with me long after I had hung up the phone. She asked whether Thomas had kept records at home, or whether everything was handled through the attorney's office. I said I was still going through his files. She said, "Of course. Take your time," and offered to fly up and help with the paperwork whenever I needed her. She said she was familiar with estate documents, and it would be no trouble. I thanked her. I ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, and I thought about the question. Had Thomas kept records at home? It was a reasonable question from an accountant. It was also a very specific question for someone who was simply checking in on her grieving mother-in-law. That afternoon, I drove to Mercer Street. First Coastal Bank was a small branch in a neighborhood I had driven past many times but never stopped in. I asked for the safety deposit box by number, the way Thomas's note had instructed. The woman at the desk was professional and unhurried. She confirmed my identification, confirmed that my name was listed on the account, and walked me to the back room without ceremony. I had not known my name was on the account. Thomas had added me without mentioning it, which meant he had always intended for me to find it. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to tell me, and the right moment had never come. And then it was too late. The box was larger than I had expected. Inside was a manila envelope, sealed, with my name written on the outside in Thomas's handwriting. Beneath the envelope was a second, smaller envelope, and beneath that, a USB drive in a plastic sleeve. I took the box to the private viewing room and opened the large envelope first. The letter was 6 pages, handwritten on yellow legal paper, the same kind Thomas had used for lesson plans for 30 years. He wrote the way he had always spoken, clearly, carefully, with a teacher's habit of making sure you understood each step before moving to the next. He had discovered it 14 months before he died. Not all at once. Gradually. The way you notice something is wrong with a car, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in small things that accumulate until you can no longer ignore them. Thomas had managed our retirement accounts throughout our marriage. He had also, 8 years ago, added Daniel to one of those accounts as a cosigner, a precaution. He had thought at the time, in case Thomas became incapacitated and I needed someone to manage the funds. Daniel had the legal authority to authorize transactions. What Thomas had discovered was that Renata had been using that authority, not Daniel. He wrote. He was careful about this. He believed, and the documentation supported, that Daniel had not initiated anything, but Renata had access to Daniel's login credentials for the account she managed their household finances. And Daniel had given her that access years ago without thinking much about it. She had used it over a period of approximately 22 months. She had transferred a total of $187,000 out of the retirement account through a series of transactions she had structured to look like routine portfolio rebalancing. She was an accountant. She knew what she was doing. She had routed the funds through a joint investment account she held with a business partner, a man named Craig Sellers, and from there, into what appeared to be a real estate holding entity. Thomas had found out by accident. He had called the investment firm to ask a routine question about a quarterly statement and had been told by the representative that several of the funds he was asking about had been moved to a different account at his request. Thomas had not made that request. He had spent the following 3 months tracing every transaction, printing every statement, documenting everything with the same meticulous patience he had once used to document 30 years of student records. He had not confronted Renata. He had not told Daniel. He had been afraid. He wrote, not for himself, but for his son. He believed Daniel did not know. He was almost certain of it. And he could not find a way to protect my financial future without also destroying Daniel's marriage and possibly Daniel's understanding of the woman he loved. And he had not been able to make himself do it while he was alive. I know this was cowardly. He wrote near the end of the letter. I told myself it was complicated. But the truth is that I was afraid of what it would cost all of us. You never ran from the things that cost you. I hope you can forgive me for relying on that when I no longer could. I folded the letter, sat with it in my hands for a moment, and then opened the smaller envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a list of every transaction, every account number, every date, with brief notations in Thomas's handwriting explaining what each one represented. 31 entries. He had listed them chronologically, from the first small transfer to the last large one, 11 days before his final hospitalization. I looked at that last date for a long time. Then I opened the USB drive on my phone. Using an adapter Thomas had thoughtfully included in the plastic sleeve, the drive contained scanned copies of every bank statement he had referenced, printed emails between Renata and Craig Sellers discussing the transfers, and a folder Thomas had labeled "Read This Last" that contained a single document, a summary he had written in plain language, as though he were writing it for a jury. Every fact, every number, every date, Step by step. Cause and effect. The way a teacher writes a lesson plan. I sat in that small private room at First Coastal Bank for almost 2 hours. I read everything twice. I photographed every document with my phone and backed them up to my cloud account. I returned the box to its slot, thanked the woman at the desk, and drove home. I did not call Daniel. I did not call Renata. I called no one. That evening I sat in Thomas's armchair in the living room with his journal on my lap, not reading it, just holding it, and I thought about what he had written. You never ran from the things that cost you. I had not always believed that about myself. Thomas had always believed it about me more than I did. I began researching attorneys the following morning. I had used a family attorney for our will and estate planning for years. But Thomas's letter had suggested caution. He had noted that Renata had met this attorney at a professional event 2 years ago and had corresponded with him about estate tax strategies. He could not confirm any wrongdoing on the attorney's part. But he had recommended I find someone new and choose carefully. I spent 2 evenings making a list. I eliminated 2 firms for reasons I found in public records. One had a pending bar complaint. One had done work for Craig Sellers' company. The third name on my list was a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been practicing estate and financial fraud law in Roanoke for 19 years. Her reviews described her as methodical and relentless. One review, written by someone who identified herself only as a widow, said, "She read every single document. She did not miss anything." I called her office on a Tuesday morning and made an appointment. It was the following Thursday when Renata's behavior changed. She called that evening, and the warmth in her voice was still present, but had shifted in a way I recognized without being able to immediately name. It was the warmth of someone managing a situation rather than feeling it. She said she had been thinking about me, which I believed. She said she and Daniel had been talking, and they wanted to make sure I had everything I needed for the estate process, which was also probably true. And then she said that she had spoken with a financial advisor who had suggested it might be worth consolidating some of Thomas's accounts sooner rather than later, to avoid any complications with probate timelines, and that she would be happy to help me coordinate that if I sent her the account information. I told her I was working with an attorney and that everything was being handled. She said, of course. Naturally. She just wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed. I said I was managing. After I hung up, I sat very still. Renata was an accountant. She knew exactly what probate timelines looked like. She did not need to call me with that advice. She was not offering help. She was testing whether I had found anything. I drove to Patricia Osei's office on Friday morning and told her everything. I placed the envelope and the USB drive on her desk. Patricia Osei read Thomas's summary document without speaking. Then she looked up. "Your husband documented this extraordinarily well," she said. "He was a teacher." I said, "He believed if you couldn't show your work." The answer didn't matter. She was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did he pass 6 weeks? And you found this when, 11 days ago?" She looked at me steadily. "You've been carrying this alone for 11 days. I didn't know who to tell." I said. She nodded. "You can tell me." She uncapped her pen. "Let's start at the beginning." Patricia filed the first legal motions within a week. She was thorough in a way that reminded me of Thomas, not in temperament. She was warmer than he had been with strangers, but in her approach to detail, she explained each step in plain language. The way a good teacher explains a difficult concept here is what we are doing. Here is why. Here is what it means. She filed a formal claim against the retirement account on the grounds of unauthorized transactions. Citing the documentation Thomas had assembled, She also submitted a referral to the Virginia State Corporation Commission's Financial Fraud Division and notified the investment firm, which froze the account pending review. "The documentation your husband left?" she said at our second meeting. Reviewing Thomas's summary for the third time is the kind of thing most attorneys spend months trying to reconstruct after the fact. He built the entire case for us. I felt something tighten in my chest. He spent the last year of his life building it. I said, he did it alone because he was trying to protect Daniel. Patricia set the papers down and looked at me. His instinct to protect his son is understandable. But what he left you is more than evidence. It's an act of trust. I drove home and tried to return to the ordinary rhythm of my days, which was harder than it sounds when the ordinary rhythm of your days has been interrupted by grief and then by this. I walked in the mornings. I cooked dinner, though I rarely finished it. I called my friend Lorraine, who had been my closest friend for 25 years and who had the particular gift of listening without immediately trying to fix. I did not tell Lorraine everything. Not yet. I was still sorting through what I knew and what I felt about it. And those are different kinds of sorting. Daniel called 8 days after Patricia filed the motions. Not Renata. Daniel. His voice was the voice I had heard my entire adult life, my son's voice. But it was doing something unfamiliar. It was too measured, too careful. Like someone reading from a script they had memorized but not yet internalized. He said he had been contacted by a law firm about a claim filed against one of Dad's accounts. I said yes. I had filed it. He said he didn't understand why I hadn't talked to him first. I said I was entitled to retain legal counsel. He said, of course. Of course you are. Mum. A pause. But he didn't understand what I thought had happened. And he wanted to make sure I hadn't been given incorrect information by someone who didn't understand the full picture. He and Renata had been involved in managing some of those accounts with Dad's knowledge. There were conversations he and Dad had had that I might not be aware of. I asked him to describe one of those conversations. Silence, I said. Daniel, I found everything your father left me. I have the account statements. I have the transaction records. I have the emails between Renata and Craig Sellers. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It was the silence of someone who has been walking carefully across ice and has just heard it crack beneath them. Then Renata's voice came on the line. She had been there the entire time. I had suspected she would be Margaret, she said. Her voice was composed in a way that Daniel's had not been. Deliberate. Each word placed like a chess piece. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about what those documents represent. What you're describing as unauthorized was discussed with Thomas directly. He understood the purpose of those transfers. He supported them. I said, then you'll have no difficulty explaining that to the Financial Fraud Division. A pause. When she spoke again, her warmth was still technically present but had thinned considerably. Margaret, I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. You're talking about legal proceedings, investigations. Do you understand what that kind of process costs? Not just financially, in time, in stress, in what it does to a family. You are 68 years old. This will take years. Potentially. Is that really how you want to spend this time? I held the phone with both hands. You are 68 years old. She had delivered it as a concern. It was not a concern. It was a calculation, the same calculation someone makes when they assume that age and grief together equal surrender. I said, Renata, I spent 39 years married to a man who taught me that the most important thing you can do is pay attention. I have paid attention. I have read every document. I have a very capable attorney. And I am 68 years old. which means I have had 68 years of practice at knowing exactly when someone is trying to manage me. She was quiet. I said, "Please direct all further communication to my attorney." And I ended the call. My hands were not shaking. I noticed this with something that was not quite surprise. I had expected them to. I called Lorraine that evening and told her everything. All of it. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always loved most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That woman looked at your husband the way someone looks at a problem they are calculating how to solve." I said, "You noticed that?" She said, "I noticed it at Thanksgiving 3 years ago. I didn't think it was my place to say." We sat with that for a while. The two of us on the phone in our separate houses. In the particular companionship of women who have known each other long enough to say the true thing, the letter from Daniel arrived on a Monday. Hand-delivered to my mailbox. He had not knocked. He had left it and gone. That, more than anything else, told me what I needed to know about the current state of my son's autonomy in his own marriage. The letter was professionally worded. I recognized Renata's precision in it. Even through Daniel's signature, it proposed a private settlement of $60,000, described as a family reconciliation gift. In exchange for the withdrawal of all formal legal proceedings, it framed this as the compassionate option, the one that would allow the family to heal without the damage of public exposure. Near the end, there was a line that I read twice. "Prolonged legal action at this stage of your life is unlikely to serve your best interests or your health." At this stage of your life? Again, I brought the letter to Patricia. She read it with professional neutrality. 60,000, she said. Against 187. Yes, I said. She set the letter down. They're frightened. You don't offer a third of the amount unless you're frightened. I asked whether I should be concerned about what came next. She said, "People in this position tend to escalate when the first offer is refused. Be prepared for that. But the documentation you have is not the kind of documentation that improves for them over time. Every day that passes is a day the paper trail speaks louder." I thanked her and drove home. That evening, for the first time since Thomas had passed, I went to a grief support group that met on Monday evenings at the community center on Briarwood Avenue. Lorraine had mentioned it 3 times over the preceding months. And I had resisted 3 times. And I finally stopped resisting. The group was 7 women. They ranged in age from 57 to 79. They were funny in the way that women who have survived things tend to be funny, not performing humor, but finding it in the places where it genuinely lives. 2 of them had navigated contested estates. One had spent 2 years in a legal dispute with her late husband's business partner. That woman, whose name was Sylvia, looked at me over her coffee cup at the end of the evening and said, "The first thing they count on is that you won't want to make things messy. The second thing they count on is that you will get tired." She paused. "The third thing they don't count on is that you won't." I drove home from that meeting feeling something I had not felt in weeks. Not happiness. Not relief. Something more like orientation. A sense of where I was standing and what the ground beneath me was made of. Daniel and Renata came on a Saturday morning in late November. I saw their car in the driveway from the kitchen window while I was making coffee. The charcoal gray sedan Renata had bought the previous year. I had not been warned. They had not called. The absence of a call told me everything I needed to know before I opened the door. Daniel was wearing the expression I had seen on him since childhood, when he had done something he knew was wrong and was hoping to resolve it through sincerity rather than accountability. Renata stood beside him. Not behind him, as she might have once, but beside him, shoulder to shoulder, which was unusual. She was wearing a dark green jacket and carrying a small paper box from the French bakery near their hotel that she knew I liked. The box sat on my coffee table for the entire visit. I did not open it. Neither of them mentioned it. I made coffee because having something to do with your hands is useful in certain situations. I poured for myself. I sat in Thomas's armchair and waited. Daniel began. He was sorry. He said. He was sorry for the phone call. Sorry for the letter. Sorry for how difficult these months had been. He and Renata had been under tremendous financial pressure, credit card debt, a business investment that had not gone as planned. The weight of expenses, accumulating faster than they could manage. He did not use the word stolen. He used phrases like bridging an anticipated inheritance. A short-term arrangement. Something Dad had indicated he understood. He said all of this with the conviction of someone who had rehearsed it until it felt like memory. He did not look at me while he spoke. He looked at the coffee table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked everywhere except at his mother, sitting 3 feet away in his father's chair. I had learned to let silence do its work. Thomas had taught me that. Let the structure show its own weaknesses before you push. Then Renata spoke. She leaned forward slightly, and her voice shifted. Registers warmer, more intimate, woman to woman, in a way that was precise and entirely calculated. Margaret, I know this year has been devastating. Losing Thomas. Being alone in this house. The weight of all of this. Nobody wants you to spend what should be a time of rest and healing sitting in courtrooms with lawyers. You deserve to be with your grandchildren. She paused, reading my face. The way someone reads a document for a specific piece of information. If you drop the proceedings, we can sit down together and come up with something that feels fair to everyone. We want to take care of you. That is genuinely what this is about. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the bakery box. I thought about the word fair, how easily it comes to people who have taken something that did not belong to them. How they reach for it, like a tool they are owed. I thought about Thomas in his study, spending 12 months building a case he was too afraid to use while he was alive, because he could not find a way to protect what was mine without also destroying what he loved. I was not going to let that work mean nothing. I set down my coffee cup. What you took from me, I said, was $187,000. Your letter offered 60. What you're describing now is something fair. What number did you have in mind? Renata's expression shifted. Just slightly. The way a mask adjusts when the person behind it takes a breath they did not intend to take. That's not really the point, she said. The point is finding a resolution. That doesn't. The point, I said, is that fairness is not a feeling. It is a number. And the number I can document to a court is $187,000 plus my legal costs. Daniel started to say something. Renata put her hand on his arm a small time. His practiced gesture, and he stopped. He stopped the way he had stopped since before I could remember. When she signaled him to, there was a moment then where I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for just a second I saw the boy underneath. The boy who had cried so hard when Thomas got lost at the state fair and been so relieved when he found him again. The boy who had called home from college every Sunday because he missed us more than he wanted to admit. He was in there somewhere, underneath everything that had grown over him. Then Renata stood, and the moment closed. She picked up the bakery box slowly, deliberately, a composed act of retrieval, and tucked it under her arm. She had brought it as a gesture of warmth. She was taking it back as a statement. I said, I think you should go. They left. I listened to the car back out of the driveway and disappear down Sycamore Lane. I sat very still for several minutes afterward. I was not confident. I want to be honest about that. I was afraid. In a real and specific way. Because these were people who had means and motive and a demonstrated willingness to act. But underneath the fear was something that did not move. Thomas had been afraid too. And his fear had cost both of us. I had made a different choice. I intended to keep making it. The hearing was scheduled for the second Wednesday in February. In a civil courtroom. In downtown Roanoke. Patricia had spent the preceding weeks preparing me with the same thoroughness she brought to everything else. We reviewed the documents. She walked me through the sequence of transactions. The email chain. The account modification forms. She told me what to expect from the opposing attorney, a man named Clifford Marsh, who handled primarily tax litigation, whose familiarity with financial fraud case law Patricia described, with careful understatement, as limited. She also told me something I did not expect. The night before, she said, "Get a full night's sleep if you can. Eat breakfast. Wear something you have worn before. Nothing new. Nothing uncomfortable. And when you are in that room, you do not need to perform anything. You are a 68-year-old widow with a folder of documentation that speaks entirely for itself. Your job is to be present. The documents do the work." I dressed carefully. Gray blazer. Dark slacks. The low heels I had owned for 12 years and trusted completely. I arrived before Daniel and Renata. I found my seat beside Patricia, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, wood-paneled, fluorescent lit. With the particular quiet of rooms, where consequential things regularly happen. The judge was a man in his early 60s, deliberate in his movements, with the expression of someone who had heard many versions of this story and was prepared to hear one more without flinching. That steadiness was, unexpectedly, a comfort. They came in together. Renata wore a charcoal dress and carried herself with the self-possession of someone who had decided that composure was the only remaining advantage available to her. Daniel walked slightly behind her. Clifford Marsh settled in beside them with the ease of a man who had not yet fully assessed the strength of what he was walking into. Marsh opened on their behalf with what Patricia had predicted, a narrative of voluntary family financial planning, verbal agreements made in good faith, and a characterization of my legal action as a misinterpretation of Thomas's intentions, driven by grief and incomplete information. He was smooth. He was confident. He was building on a foundation that Thomas had already, methodically, dismantled from the inside. Patricia's presentation was quieter and took half as long. She presented the documentation in chronological order without editorializing. She let the numbers do their work. I watched the judge's face as Patricia walked through each exhibit. His expression did not change. His pen moved steadily across his notepad. It moved more when Patricia was speaking. The first recess came after 2 hours. I stood in the hallway with Patricia and drank water from a paper cup and did not say much. Through the tall windows at the corridor's end, I could see the February sky pale, clear. The kind of winter sky that has no particular feeling about human proceedings one way or another. I was grateful for it. I breathed and thought about the garden, which would need attention in the spring. Renata was called to testify. She was careful at first, consistent with the verbal agreement narrative, describing her financial relationship with Thomas in terms of transparency and collaboration. She used the word family often. She spoke of Thomas with an affection she had assembled for the occasion. Patricia cross-examined her with 3 emails from the chain Thomas had printed. The ones discussing the transfers in language that did not resemble a voluntary family arrangement before the situation gets complicated. Keep this between the principals. C. Will route through the second entity to avoid flags. Patricia asked her to explain how that language was consistent with an openly agreed-upon family financial plan. Renata said it was internal shorthand. Professional language from her accounting background. Not indicative of concealment. Patricia showed her the account modification form, the one requiring my co-authorization to change the account structure, the one that had been submitted without my signature. She asked Renata to identify the signature in the co-authorization line. Renata said there may have been a processing error. Patricia asked whether Renata was familiar with the Virginia statute governing document falsification in financial transactions. The room was very quiet. For the first time, Renata's eyes moved. Not to Patricia. Not to the judge. Not to Clifford Marsh. But to Daniel. A small, involuntary movement. The instinct of someone who has exhausted her prepared responses and is looking for something to hold on to. Daniel was looking at the table. He did not look back at her. That moment, Renata turning toward her husband and finding nothing there was, I thought, its own kind of verdict. Delivered before the official one. Daniel's testimony came next. He told the verbal agreement story as he had been told to tell it. But when Patricia asked him to describe the specific conversation in which Thomas had explicitly approved the transfer of retirement funds to Renata's business entity, his account differed from Renata's in 3 details: the month, the location, and whether Thomas had been alone with Daniel or whether Renata had been present. Patricia noted this discrepancy for the record without emphasis. She did not need emphasis. The discrepancy noted itself. I looked at my son while Patricia spoke. He was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table most of the day. I had watched Daniel for 43 years, and I knew what that posture meant. He had never been able to hold a false story without it showing somewhere in his body. As a child, it had been his hands. As a man, it was his eyes. He could not look at things directly when he was ashamed. Mr. Calloway, Patricia said, did your father ever, in your direct presence, explicitly authorize the transfer of his retirement savings to an account controlled by your wife's business partner? Daniel was silent for 5 seconds. I counted. He understood the general purpose. He said finally, that is not what I asked. Patricia said. The room was very still. The ruling came 5 weeks later. I was at home when Patricia called me. Full restitution. She said, $187,000, plus legal costs. The court has also accepted the referral to the Financial Fraud Division. And regarding the co-authorization signature, the court found it to be a falsified document. That finding has been forwarded to the Commonwealth's attorney. I sat down in Thomas's armchair. It's a felony. Margaret, Patricia said. It will be prosecuted separately. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something quieter. The resolution of a long-sustained tension. The way a room feels when a window that has been painted shut for years is finally opened and the air moves through it. Not dramatic. Just right, Patricia said. Before we ended the call, something I had not expected from her. Your husband did extraordinary work. He did, I said. He just didn't trust himself to use it while he was living. A pause. You trusted yourself. I did not know what to say to that. I thanked her. I held the phone for a moment after we hung up. And I thought about Thomas at his kitchen table in the evenings, going through those statements one by one, building a record he was afraid to use, building it anyway. leaving it for me. He had known I would find it. He had known I would know what to do with it. He had trusted me with the hardest thing he had ever assembled and had not told me he was doing it. Because he knew the way he had always known me, that if I had known while he was living, I would have tried to protect him from the weight of it. Daniel called 3 weeks after the ruling. I answered because he was my son, which is a fact that does not become less true because of the things that surround it. He sounded exhausted. Not performed exhaustion. The real kind. "Mom," he said. Then nothing for a moment. I waited. I didn't start it. He said, "I want you to know that I found out what was happening about 6 months in, and I didn't stop it, and I told myself it was complicated and I was wrong." I said, "I know you didn't start it, Daniel, but you knew." He didn't argue. That, at least, was honest. I said, "What you allowed to happen was a betrayal of me and of your father's memory. Both of those things are true. And I love you. And I do not know yet what comes next for us. But I am not going to pretend one of those things cancels the other." He said, "I know." I ended the call. My daughter-in-law is facing 2 felony counts. Her trial is scheduled for the spring. The investment account has been restored. Renata's accounting firm she had been a partner dissolved her partnership in January. Craig Sellers is under a separate investigation that is not my matter to follow. In February, I had the garden replanted. Not the whole garden. Thomas's roses along the back fence. I left exactly as they were. They were his. And they grew the way he had tended them. A little sideways and completely alive. But the front beds, which had been bare since October, I filled with something new: deep blue salvia, white alyssum, lavender planted in long rows along the walkway. Thomas used to say that the garden was the house's way of telling you it was still paying attention. I thought it was time to give it something new to say. Lorraine and I walk 3 mornings a week now. Along the river trail. When the weather allows, we talk about our husbands, about our children, about the accumulated weight and lightness of long lives. She is the best kind of companion, someone who does not require you to be further along than you are. She said to me, on one of our walks in late March, that I seemed like myself again. I asked her what that meant. She thought about it and said, "Like you're inhabiting your life, instead of watching it happen." I turned that over carefully. The way Thomas had always turned things over, before he answered. And I decided she was right. If I have learned anything this year, and I have learned more than I wanted to, it is this: grief makes you soft. And the wrong people know exactly how to use that softness. But soft is not the same as breakable. Soft things receive pressure. They absorb it. They do not always give way. Thomas left me a locked door. He left me the key. He trusted me to walk through it. If someone you love left you something difficult to carry it anyway. You might find that you are stronger than either of you knew. What would you have done in my place? I would genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below. And please tell me what city you are listening from. Thank you so much for being here with Hannah's Stories. I'll see you in the next one.